to speak on this again. So sorry. So I'm going to go to resuming debate. The honourable member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. And why? I'm honoured to speak here in support of my colleague, the member from Desnethe, Mississippi, Churchill River, and her Bill C-369, a bill that would create a National Indigenous Peoples Day. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're gathered here on the traditional lands of the Algonquin people, and I thank them for sharing this beautiful land with all of us here. And I live in the traditional lands of the Seal people, the Okanagan Nation, and most large public gatherings in the Okanagan are opened with a traditional prayer and the singing of the Okanagan song. And the message of that song, at least the part that I've taken to heart, is we are beautiful, our land is beautiful, and we are beautiful because our land is beautiful. Now, those words emphasize the relationship between all of us and the land that sustains us, that we are nothing if we treat our land without respect, and they are powerful words. I also, I grew up on the boundary of the Penticton Indian Reserve, and I still live in that house that I grew up in. I like to tell my friends from the Penticton Indian Band that I grew up on the res, but of course I didn't grow up on the res like those people. I knew nothing as I grew up of the struggles of the kids I went to school with. I went to school with kids from the reserve, but we didn't talk much. I knew nothing of the struggles of them and their families, of the residential school situation, and as I said, I didn't really know anything about their culture, their heritage, their language at all. In fact, I didn't even know there was still people speaking a traditional language there. And in 1980, well, I remember the first time, in 1978, I was out on the Chilcotin Plateau, and I went into a cafe there, and I realized soon that everybody in the cafe was speaking Chilcotin. I had never heard an Indigenous language spoken before. I realized how little I knew of the cultures of the people that were here first, our first peoples, the first peoples of Canada. And in 1981, I met Jeanette Armstrong, someone who I've grown to know and respect a great deal. Jeanette just grew up a couple of kilometers from me in Penticton. My father knew her mother, and yet I never had met her before. And she spoke of her family's struggle to retain their culture and their language, and she spoke fluent in Tsilhqot'in, the language of the Okanagan peoples, and I was totally blown away. I had no idea that there were still speakers of that language, that the culture was still retained and so rich. And since that time, I have learned a lot from my colleagues in the First Nations communities of the Okanagan about that culture and what they have been doing to retain it and really make their people proud of that culture and get their kids learning the language again. Recently, I had the honor and very humbling experience of sitting in on an immersion class in Penticton that taught in Tsilhqot'in. It was humbling to sit there for a day hearing people speak a language that I knew very few words of, the language that was formed in that valley, in my home valley. It's literally the language of my land, and yet I knew nothing of it. I still know very few words in Tsilhqot'in. I know a few of the plants and animals. I'm a biologist, so I knew the word for speetlum was probably the only word I knew as a kid, because my father would call bitterroot speetlum. Speetlum is one of the 4 food kings, chiefs of the Okanagan peoples. It's the root that gave them sustenance through the year. I know the word for Saskatoon berry, sia, again, one of the important foods of the Okanagan people. But it wasn't until I moved back to the Okanagan in the 90s and started working a lot with people in the local First Nations communities about conservation of their lands. They were very concerned about conserving the environment of their lands, that I got to hear more of their own personal stories, people who were working with me, very dedicated workers, who had real personal struggles, families torn apart, addictions, life in residential schools that had sent them to Alberta, northern British Columbia as kids, and yet they were back working to rebuild their communities. And at the same time, my wife, Margaret, was working for the Asuyas Indian Band, building the Inkamip Desert Cultural Center, one of the most magnificent interpretive centers in the country. If you're ever in the Okanagan, I urge you to go and visit it. It's a real celebration of the seal culture and very well presented. And through her, I met other people who, again, knew their culture, knew their language, and it was just such a rich experience learning all this from my neighbors, basically. And yet, as Canadians, we don't get that opportunity very often. And some of the projects I worked with brought kids together, kids from the First Nations community with non-Indigenous kids together to do habitat rehabilitation, to plant trees and shrubs. And at the same time, they were planting seeds of reconciliation in our communities. And I've seen such a change over the last 20 or 30 years in the Okanagan Valley with reconciliation really building, and people are feeling a lot better, I think, about the relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples now. When I went there first in the 90s, it was very touchy, but that has really changed. And what has changed is people taking the time to learn about the others' cultures. So I'd just like to finish, Madam Speaker, by saying that, you know, many of us celebrate July 1st every year as, you know, our national day, but we haven't really, and many of us celebrate June 21st as well as the National Indigenous Peoples Days. It's not a holiday, but, you know, I attend events when I can in my community. I know a lot of people do. We learn in those events about Indigenous cultures and Indigenous heritage, Indigenous languages, but I think it would really mean so much more if it was a national holiday, and I really want to support my colleagues' initiative here to create a national statutory holiday. We have the Yukon and the Northwest Territories have set a precedent with making June 21st a holiday in those territories to ensure that people have the time and the mindset to really set aside a day to learn about these important issues, to really take important steps toward reconciliation. So I would just like to finish there and say Limlind. Thank you.